1914 was a very significant year for Downside in a number of ways, because it was not only the year in which our main school building, the quad as we now know it, the Roberts Tower and all the rest of it, were formally opened by Cardinal Gasquet, but it was also the first centenary of our establishment here. I put it that way round because obviously 1914 is a year which in most people's memory is associated so closely with the beginnings of the First World War. And by a curious act of coincidence or fate, the First World War was deeply important in the life of Gasquet himself, because as an English curial cardinal resident in Rome, he was able to influence, or at least attempt to influence, Pope Benedict XV, the Pope at the time, who was regarded by the British and French government with deep suspicion as, at best, a vague sympathizer of the German and Austrian cause. In his own estimation, of course, Pope Benedict was a pope of peace, but we'll come back to that later. The title of this conference, the Holy See and England, is there because during Cardinal Gasquet's career, a formal diplomatic arrangement was made between the Crown and the Holy See, really for the first time, and we'll come back to that later. It's my intention really today just to put Cardinal Gasquet into his context. I hope during the day all of us will visit his magnificent tomb, which is perhaps the thing that people now know most about him. It's on the cover of that architectural history book. It appears in Pevsner's Somerset volume, and it now has a life of its own as a work of art. But Cardinal Gasquet himself is hardly remembered. I suppose it's because he was never a diocesan bishop. He's not associated with a particular place, except Downside, and as we will see, he left Downside relatively early in his career and spent little time here in the last 30 years of his life. What he is also known for is being a bad historian. And I always think this is a bit of a pity, because as soon as you mention the name Gasquet, you hear about bias, poor use of sources, Catholic propaganda, and all those sort of things. In fact, Cardinal Gasquet's influence as a historian was extremely large, and his influence as a writer was one of the most important elements in the construction of Downside as a monastic community, because he was the first influential historian who brought history, as it were, of a Catholic kind into the arena of the academy. History, of course, as a subject, developed greatly in the 19th and 20th centuries. It stopped being the preserve of the gifted amateur and moved towards the professionalism of the academy. But it has never lost its capacity for controversy and its use as propaganda. I'm always amazed by how one can use history as a way of putting forward one's own ideas. And it is always, I think, significant that, for example, so many headmasters of schools are historians. Machiavellians to a man. National identity, the legitimacy of government and dynasties, and religious divisions all stirred division and difference of opinion and were far too important to be taken lightly. And of course, in England particularly, religion and national identity were closely linked, and a patriotic narrative history identified Roman Catholicism, rejected at the Reformation, as the enemy of the state. It was difficult, perhaps impossible, for a Catholic defence of the pre-Reformation world, or even of the post-Reformation one, to be taken by the historical establishment as a serious contention. In the early 19th century, John Lingard, 1771 to 1851, the most influential of English Catholic historians, had a European reputation as a judicious user of sound primary sources. But even he, being a priest, was viewed by some critics as incapable of impartiality. His writings, sermons with the most sanctified appearance of impartiality. He had dared, however, to assail the central myths of national identity, attacking both Henry VIII and Elizabeth. He influenced William Cobbett in his History of the Protestant Reformation in England, published in the 1820s, and thus began what could be seen as the gradual infiltration of a Catholic view into English national history. The dissolution of the monasteries was perhaps the most dramatic act of the Reformation period, and a strong anti-monastic sentiment was part of the national myth. Just think of that wonderful Hogarth print of Calais Gate with that superb monk standing there, a personification of greed and superstition. The dissolution of the monasteries was seen too by the leaders of the Enlightenment, including not a few Catholics, as a necessary part of the reform of a debased and irrelevant church. To defend the monasteries at the time of the Reformation and to celebrate their role in the church of the time was not something for a Lingard to do. He was too much a child of the Enlightenment. The revival of monasticism, especially in its Benedictine form, was a romantic response in part to the failure of Catholics to identify themselves with the Enlightenment. Monasticism, with its rejection of modern society and its ideals of secular progress, epitomized a new militancy in a Catholicism whose very future existence had been questioned by the French Revolution. It took a monk historian to bring back the place of monasticism into the debate on the English Reformation and to question the assertion that the English Reformation was needed to reform a decadent church. That monk was Francis Aidan Gasquet. By bringing back the subject of monasticism and the Catholic Church into the national debate, Gasquet, for the first time really, allowed English people to see that Englishness did not mean a dismissal of Catholicism. Francis Neil Gasquet himself was born in London on the 5th of October 1846. His father, Dr. Raymond Gasquet, who died in 1856, was, as his name suggests, of French origin. His grandfather, a strong royalist from Toulon in the south of France, had emigrated to England, allowing the young Raymond to be trained as a physician in Winchester, where he was apprenticed to a certain Dr. Lyford. Winchester is interesting because Winchester, one of the greatest of English Catholic missions, was also the place where the largest concentration of French exiles in the country was experienced during the Revolution. And it's interesting too that Raymond served as a surgeon in the Royal Navy. His mother, Mary Apollonia Kay, was from Yorkshire. A combination of Yorkshire and French sounds pretty fierce to me. And I think that these two characteristics of his background come out in some of the things I'll say later on. Francis, always known to his family and friends as Frank, considering how pompous and important Gasquet came eventually, it comes as a shock when you see these letters signed Frank at the bottom, not Aidan Cardinal Gasquet or anything like that. He spent his first 10 years in Somers Town near the present Euston Station, which is an area of resort for many French exiles of all sorts and conditions, who had gathered around the chapel of St. Aloysius, opened in 1808 by the Abbé Guy Caron, a legendary figure in émigré London, who had built up a network of schools and social services for his fellow countrymen and women. Caron's practical Christianity was combined with a fierce adhesion to the Ancien regime in France. Gasquet's whole paternal background must have filled him with sentiments of tradition, patriotism to both England and France, and service, which never left him. On his father's death, the family moved socially upward to the new district of Bayswater, still on the wrong side of the park perhaps, but more respectable than the already declining Somers Town area. It had its own Caron in the form of Henry Edward Manning, the future Cardinal, who was to make the Catholic Church in Morehouse Road the centre of his pastoral activities until his appointment to Westminster in 1865. Cardinal Manning, whose portrait appears at the centre of the exhibition behind, was to be a key influence on the young Gasquet, who seems to have been a somewhat churchy youth. He acted more than once as Cardinal Wiseman's train-bearer and was an altar server at Manning's church. Manning's inclinations were less liturgical than Wiseman's, but Gasquet's erect bearing and dignity must have owed something to his earliest radical formation. Gasquet may, if things had gone differently indeed, have stayed in London. Indeed, the young Francis, according to the manuscript Fasti book of Downside, was for 2 years, from 1860 to 1862, a putative member of the Oblates of St. Charles, which was Manning's new community of secular priests, a counterpart to Newman's oratory. Manning was to take an important part again in Gasquet's life rather more than 20 years later, but in 1862 Gasquet was sent to Downside in Somerset to be a pupil here at our school. He came to Downside in the autumn of 1862 and left in July 1865. A younger brother, Lewis, was in the school from 1864 to 68. In the last decade of the 19th century and the first of the 20th, Downside adopted the style and ambitions of the English public school system. But in Gasquet's school days, it retained the character of a Catholic school on more or less Jesuit lines, which it had received from its earliest days at Douai in France, where the English Benedictine priory had been established in the early 17th century. Downside was to be Gasquet's spiritual home for the rest of his life. At Gasquet's arrival, the monastic community numbered 15 and the school 50. A very interesting proportion. In other words, the school and the monastery were very close to each other, and the numbers in the school exceptionally low. Many of the pupils were, in fact, church students on their way to entering the community, and most of the monks were young. In that, I think, times have changed. The older members of the community were principally engaged in pastoral ministry in the many missions served by the English Benedictines across the country. The pastoral priority is reflected in that Downside was well known for its many bishops in Gasquet's time. There were 2 members of the restored English and Welsh hierarchy, Ullathorne in Birmingham, Brown in Newport, still serving the church, and the Archbishop of Sydney, Bede Polding, had also been a member of the community. The monastic and school religious services were held in what is now known as the Old Chapel, and the whole campus was small in scale and sited in rural isolation. It was a retreat given here in 1864 by Dom Bede Vaughan, later Polding's successor as Archbishop of Sydney, which stirred Gasquet's vocation to the monastic life. And in 1866, he entered Belmont in Herefordshire to commence his monastic formation and studies. Downside had presumably provided a sound classical foundation for his future studies, as well as nurturing his religious vocation, but it was probably his years at Belmont which inspired him to a higher view of the monastic state and a clearer view of the Benedictine order's place in the church. It also began to make him a scholar. The community of St. Michael at Belmont in the outskirts of Hereford, which became Belmont Abbey in 1920, was established in 1860 as the common novitiate and house of studies for the 3 English Benedictine priories of Downside, Ampleforth and Dowie. Its fine church also served as the cathedral of the Welsh Catholics in their diocese of Newport and Menevia. For half a century, Belmont provided formation, discernment and education for over 500 novices and newly professed, becoming the supreme English Benedictine academy of the period, and crucially influencing the future shape of the English Benedictine congregation throughout the 20th century by means of the scholars and writers it produced. The learned tradition of the English Benedictines during the 17th century had been sustained by those like Augustine Baker and Serenus Cressy, who had compiled historical and antiquarian material to demonstrate continuity between the medieval and the early modern English Benedictine congregation. The researchers of Dom Bennett Weldon prolonged this approach, but by the 19th century, mission work had become the normal occupation of the English monks and had, with few exceptions, precluded scholarship. There was no resources for the great historical enterprises of the French Moorish congregation, and little obvious enthusiasm for such activity. It was Belmont's primary role to educate the English monks, but their apostolic work in their schools and missions. But by the end of the 1860s, it had adopted an Oxbridge-style tutorial system for teaching higher studies under the inspiration of its prior, Dom Bede Vaughan, and his director of studies, Dom Cuthbert Headley, later Bishop of Newport and Menevia. I mention these people because Gasquet has often been described as an amateur scholar. We have to remember that in the 19th century, history was not a subject taught at either Oxford or Cambridge or the newer universities of Durham and London. At Belmont, Wilfrid Raynor, another Downside monk, who was professor of church history, published a work on the Ordinal of King Edward VI, a subject later taken up by Gasquet. At Belmont, as its critics, especially among those dedicated to the mission, were all too aware, the groundwork for the reform and remonasticizing of the English Benedictines was being prepared. The key to this process was the revival of the study of writings of Augustine Baker. So it was at Belmont that Gasquet was influenced by the idea that monastic life should be based on an enclosed religious house and that scholarship was an important part of that work. Gasquet returned to Downside full-time in 1870 and was ordained priest in 1874. He was busily engaged in teaching, obviously without any teaching qualifications, but that probably made him a more effective teacher. History was now his forte, and he was prefect of studies from 1876 to 78 and professor of theology from 1876. This grand-sounding title meant that he was responsible for teaching theology to the junior monks. He compiled a catalogue of the monastery's library, the first to be made, during his period, and before his election on the 27th of August 1878 as prior of St. Gregory's. Until 1900, there were no abbots of Downside or headmasters, and the dual role of religious superior and school principal was the responsibility of the prior. So in 1878, he became responsible for the whole establishment. He was chosen again at the General Chapter of the English Benedictine Congregation in 1883. He was to resign this office following a breakdown in health in the summer of 1885. The youthful and energetic Prior Gasquet was much involved in the development of his community, both as a centre of a revitalised monastic life and as a place where, even more than Belmont, the built environment reflected the aspirations and ideals of the place. This was reflected in the start being made on a new monastic church to replace the old chapel. This owed much to Dom Bernard Murphy, the Irishman who was Gasquet's predecessor of Prior of Downside, a dynamic leader and a great builder, and to Gasquet himself. Rory O'Donnell, in his recent contribution to the study of Downside Abbey's architectural history, described the semi-completed building as opened in 1882 as Gasquet's church. While this was going on, in Rome, Leo XIII was enjoying his long pontificate. And the pontificate of Leo XIII was crucial in the life of the Benedictines in the wider church, within the English Benedictine congregation, and on Gasquet himself. If we're talking about England and the Holy See, Leo XIII's contribution is central. He opened the Vatican archives to scholars in 1881. He established a Pontifical Biblical Commission in 1902. In 1888, he had revived the International Benedictine College in Rome under the patronage of St. Anselm. And in 1893, he created the office of Abbot Primate. He approved new constitutions for the English Benedictines in 1899, which marked the victory of those like Gasquet who wanted a return to the abbatial system of government rather than the centralised presidential system which had been in force since the early 17th century. In the years between 1885 and his appointment to the Vulgate Commission in Rome in 1907, and in the context of all the activity in the Vatican, Gasquet reinvented himself as a full-time historian. Pope Leo XIII, in opening the Vatican archives to scholars and encouraging the Benedictines to take up the study of history, had given Gasquet the lead, and it was Manning, his early mentor, who encouraged him. "We want facts," Manning said, "to correct fancies." Gasquet, first living with his mother, later in Dulwich, and later still in rented accommodation in Great Ormond Street and Harley Street, collected material and read widely in the British Museum and the Public Record Office. Thus, Gasquet reflected in his autobiography, "I worked steadily at every document I could discover. I passed some time at Oxford and went to several cathedral archives and libraries abroad, and also to Trinity College, Dublin." This was to lead in 1888 to the publication of the first volume of Henry VIII and the English Monasteries, which was to be in its 5th edition by 1893, to the beginning of a concerted campaign to propagate a Catholic view of English history, and papal recognition by Gasquet's appointment as a Doctor of Divinity by Pope Leo XIII. Manning placing the biretta to mark the honour on Gasquet's head. Manning's own scarlet biretta was the only one available, reflected, "The colour doesn't matter, and perhaps someday you will get one like it." Gasquet's publications fall into 4 main categories: scholarly editions, academic monographs and essays, accessible historical works, and devotional pieces. In the first category, the most important were the Anglo-Premonstratensian collections and the Bosworth Psalter. In the second, the already mentioned Henry VIII and the English Monasteries, and Edward VI and the Book of Common Prayer, which provided him with the ammunition he needed in 1895 when he became part of the Papal Commission, which in 1896 condemned the validity of Anglican orders. Gasquet is the villain of the piece to those who see the declaration of Anglican orders as utterly null and void, because he provided the historical evidence. The discussion on the validity of Anglican orders was one of the most prolonged of the Reformation debates, and it addressed 2 main areas. One was the question of continuity, and especially the authority of the Elizabethan Archbishop Matthew Parker's own ordination. The other was the ordinal of Edward VI. Leo XIII, relying heavily on Gasquet's study, judged the Edwardian ordinal to be defective because there could be found there no provision or words conferring the power for priests to offer sacrifice, and thus concluded that Anglican orders were invalid in both form and intention. Other notable books included his work on the Black Death, or the Great Pestilence, first published in 1893, and still actually in print, the only one of his works that is, and Henry III and the Church, 1905. The book on the Black Death identified the mid-14th century cataclysm as the true end of the Middle Ages. But most of his output concentrated on the late medieval church and its strength in the years before the break with Rome. Thus he published the Old English Bible in 1897, the Eve of the Reformation in 1899, and England under the Old Religion in 1912. He wrote in a crisp, economical style, far removed from the heaviness of much continental Catholic history of the time, and he sold well. In fact, he was probably the best-selling historian of his time, and his name, rather like David Starkey in the early 21st century, guaranteed an audience. So if you'd thought of Gasquet at that time, I think he would have been a television star of one kind or another. He was famous for his wit, his rather mordant wit, I think, which included apparently quite a lot of impersonation of Irish clergy. So think of him like that, a combination somewhere between Dave Allen and David Starkey. In the wake of this success, he produced a number of crossover books, somewhere between the scholarly and the popular, with fine illustrations and bindings. These included English Monastic Life, 1904, The Greater Abbeys of England, 1908, and Parish Life in Medieval England, 1906. What the reading public knew about medieval English monasticism and its dissolution under the Henry VIII came mainly from Gasquet. He also continued to publish more spiritual works on the English martyrs and others. Gasquet's more serious historical scholarship owed much to collaboration, and the most significant of such partnerships was with Edmund Bishop. Like Gasquet, not a university graduate, but unlike Gasquet, with a very varied educational background. He showed a precocious interest in ecclesiastical history by checking Gibbon's references and serving as an amanuensis to Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle's classic, Past and Present, 1843, in its evocation of the life of a great medieval abbey, Bury St Edmunds, was itself a pioneering study in the field which Gasquet made his own. Bishop became widely known in scholarly circles through his liturgical studies, and his great library collection is one of the most significant ones in our library here. He had very wide contact with a great number of monastic scholars on the continent, including Dom Wilmart, a monk of Salem, who was an authentic monastic scholar in the way in which Gasquet was not. And in 1867, Bishop became a Catholic and tried his vocation here at Downside. He resided at Downside for many years and returned each year, eventually leaving his library to the community. He also resided with Gasquet in the London House of Studies and collaborated with him in his more scholarly work. Bishop's high academic profile, which included a crucial role in the foundation of the Henry Bradshaw Society, gave lustre by association to Gasquet. A meticulous scholar and a man of deep principles, Bishop was part of the modernist tendency in the English Catholic community associated with Baron Friedrich von Hugel. And von Hugel spent most of his life resident in London, but was a frequent visitor here, where his body was buried at St. Benedict's Church. One of his many concerns was the relationship of Christianity to history. He had a profound spiritual influence beyond the Catholic community and was a link between the Gasquet circle and the wider world. So Bishop, back to Carlyle, across to the modernists, and closely associated with Gasquet, a very wide network of ecclesiastical and intellectual movements. As David Knowles wrote in his foreword to Nigel Abercrombie's life and work of Edmund Bishop, published in 1959, his ideas and influence have penetrated and germinated and are still working over the whole field in which they were to be pioneers. Alongside Gasquet, there were various members of the Downside community, including Dom Gilbert Dolan, Dom Norbert Burt, who assisted Gasquet in his writings and were part of a historical team here. Burt was responsible for ordering the archives of Downside and is the author of several historical works, including a history of the Benedictine mission to Australia. I put this more positive side of Gasquet's contribution because it is often forgotten, because his scholarship has been fiercely criticised by two leading historians, G.G. Coulton of Cambridge and Gasquet's own monastic confrere, Dom David Knowles. George Gordon Coulton, 1858 to 1947, had obtained only an Igretat degree at Cambridge on account of ill health, and it was only after many years as a doubting clergyman of the Church of England and as a schoolmaster that he returned to Cambridge, only becoming a Fellow of St John's College in 1919. He had been accumulating transcripts of primary sources from the Middle Ages since the 1870s, and the flow of books towards the end of his life reflected his lifelong dedication to scholarship. He was also addicted to controversy, especially with those he saw not as historians, but as apologists. His bête noire was Gasquet, who was denounced for his habit of literary dishonesty. Coulton's disagreement with Gasquet, which perhaps reached its height with the publication in the mid-1920s of the 58 pages which provided a rough list of misstatements and blunders in Cardinal Gasquet's writings, was not simply a personal one. I think most of us would love to have 58 pages of mistakes in our writings or in our lives, but I think it's quite extraordinary to publish something like that. But Coulton was a man on a mission, because Coulton believed that Gasquet revealed a Roman Catholic school of history which misrepresented the past, and particularly the English pre-Reformation past. Indeed, for Coulton, the Catholic Church itself was opposed to historical accuracy. In 1937, he wrote, "In this totalitarian religious state, an atmosphere is created not merely sectarian, but even ultra-sectarian, practically parochial. Leo XIII marks out this fenced-off part of Roman Catholic history. There is no other religious organization in the world which shows, in the very highest places, such frequent and serious historical error, and too often such blind inexperience." The criticisms of David Knowles, 1896 to 1974, were in some ways more damning than those of Coulton. Knowles, a monk of Downside like Gasquet, had turned to the writing of history after a classics degree at Cambridge and a spell as a monastic schoolmaster. He was careful in his use of sources, and unlike either Gasquet or Coulton, was a great stylist, the poetical historical celebrator of England's monastic past. His masterpiece was probably The Monastic Order in England, published in 1940, and his acceptance in the academic establishment was shown by his appointment in 1954 by Winston Churchill as Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge. It was in his Crichton lecture, reprinted in The Historian and Character and other essays, that he delivered his harsh judgment on Gasquet, suggesting waspishly that Gasquet's capacity for carelessness almost amounted to genius. In assessing Gasquet's bequest to the historical world, beyond his popular impact, his pioneering endeavours should not be overlooked. He may have lacked an eye for detail, but he had a nose for a good document. He was the first historian of the dissolution of the monasteries to make full use of the papers of Thomas Cromwell and the Court of Augmentations, as well as the revision lists of Cardinal Reginald Pole. In Gasquet's contention that archival material illuminated the truth of the past was an attempt to ally himself with the scientific approach to history categorised as modernism by Michael Bentley in his Modernising England's Past, published in 2005. The ecclesiastical career of Gasquet, dormant since 1885, was reactified by the new constitutions given to the English Benedictine congregation in 1899, which elevated the monasteries to abbatial status. Gasquet was not elected as first abbot of Downside, that he became in August 1900 the president of the English Benedictine congregation, being re-elected in 1909 and 1913. He was given the title of Abbot of St Albans. In 1903, his name appeared on the Turner to succeed Cardinal Vaughan as Archbishop of Westminster, but the see went to the exceptionally dull and more restrained Francis Alphonsus Bourne. In 1914, the Vulgate Commission moved to new headquarters in Rome to the Palazzo Sant Callisto, and in April 1914 he was told informally that he was to be created cardinal. He was named at the consistory held on the 15th of May 1914 and solemnly invested on the 28th of May 1914. Thus this celebration today at about the time of his nomination. His first titular church was San Giorgio in Velabro, Newman's titular, but he was translated to Santa Maria in Campitelli the following year. He was promoted to cardinal priest of the same church in 1924, the year of his priestly golden jubilee. His critical work at Rome centred on the Vatican Library and the archives. He became in 1917 the prefect of the archives of the Holy See, and in 1919 librarian of the Holy Roman Church. These appointments were made by Pope Benedict XV. Pius XI, Pope from 1922, had been a colleague of Gasquet's in the Vatican Library, and he had a close rapport with him. I was told very many years ago by Father Brendan Lavery at Downside that the young monks used to be taken by Gasquet to see the Pope, and whenever the Pope heard anyone was coming to see them, he got into a terrible rage, fed up with somebody yet again interfering with his private and quiet life, because I think by nature he was more of a scholar than an administrator. And apparently Gasquet could always calm him down, and the Pope would put on a nice kindly face to the young monks as they were brought in. It's interesting that Pius XI, who was the most robustly anti-fascist Pope of the 20th century, is the only Pope of the 20th century who, as far as I know, has not been mentioned for canonization. I don't know why. I feel a bit sorry for him. His original name was Ratti. Perhaps that was part of the problem. And it was probably to this Pope that Gasquet addressed the famous line, when trying to calm him down, "No one is infallible." The First World War brought out Gasquet's patriotism, and in a papal court dominated still by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he provided an English voice. He was, as it were, John Bull in scarlet. In conversation with Cardinal Hartmann, Archbishop of Cologne, the German mused, "I will not insult you by talking of the war." "Eminence," replied Gasquet, "I will not mock you by talking about peace." In the Times obituary for the 6th of April 1929, Gasquet was praised for serving his country's interests. In 1924, he'd received King George V and Queen Mary at the Vatican Library, and in the same year, through Sir Odo Russell, British Minister to the Holy See, he was congratulated on his jubilee with the words that his invaluable life may long be preserved in the discharge of the duties of his office, and to carry on those works which have made him famous and revered by his brothers in the British Empire. Gasquet had played a significant part in the opening of the diplomatic channels between Great Britain with the appointment of a British minister to the Vatican in 1914. He died in Rome on the 5th of April 1929 and was buried at Downside under the tomb I referred to at the beginning, designed by Giles Gilbert Scott with a striking effigy by G. Carter Preston, completed in 1933. The Downside Abbey Church is part of Gasquet's bequest, as is the tradition of historians which distinguish the Downside community in the 20th century. Knowles was perhaps his greatest, if disloyal, disciple, but Abbot Cuthbert Butler, pioneer of studies on the rule of St Benedict and monastic historian, Dom Hugh Connolly, the master of patristic studies, Dom Aelred Watkin, the historian of medieval Glastonbury, Dom Adrian Morey, the editor of Gilbert Folliot's letters, and Dom Thomas Simmons, editor of the Regularis Concordia, were all in his debt. All but the last were graduates of the University of Cambridge, Coulton University. The foundation of Bennet House, a downside house of studies at Cambridge, for those reading for degrees mainly at Christ's at the universities, are in some ways a continuation of the London House of Historical Research inaugurated by Gasquet. Medieval monasticism and the nuanced view of the Reformation owe much of their present configuration to Gasquet's writings. His references may be at times uncertain, but his analysis remains influential. It's probably relatively clear that Hilaire Belloc's historical views are important, but it may be that without Gasquet it would not have been possible either to have had Philip Hughes or J.J. Scarisbrick or Eamon Duffy, or even perhaps A.G. Dickens or Dermot McCulloch. When one thinks then of Gasquet's contribution to the church, one sees it in three directions. One is in the history of the community at Downside and the English Benedictine congregation. The building of the great Abbey Church here as a symbol of monastic solidarity. The development of the English Benedictine congregation as a monastic congregation. Secondly, one sees him in his work in Rome, in the Vatican archives, as an English voice during the First World War, as an influential figure in the development of diplomatic ties between the Great Britain and the Holy See. I always hesitate a bit about England and Great Britain because obviously the English identity is very important, and perhaps in a year's time we may have to rethink about the whole use of the word Great Britain anyway. Thirdly was his historical writing. His historical writing, which has an impact on all studies of the late medieval period and on the history of monasticism, and shows that it is possible for a priest and a monk to be a historian and a person who opens up new fields. Gasquet was an interesting man in himself. There are many anecdotes and stories about him, but his influence was also important. In 1903, as I said, he almost became Archbishop of Westminster. There were three names on the list, the three last names that go to Rome. Two of them were Benedictine, one was Cuthbert Headley, one was Aidan Gasquet, and the third was Francis Bourne, and it was the non-Benedictine who made it. But in the period of Bourne's archbishopric, as the archives at Downside suggest, Gasquet provided an extraordinary link between the English bishops and the Holy See. They trusted him as someone in whom they could be totally confident and indiscreet, and that correspondence is a fascinating one. In fact, the whole of the archives of Gasquet are very fascinating and interesting, and Tim Hopkinson Ball, one of the staff here, has put together an exhibition from the archives on Cardinal Gasquet, which I highly recommend you to look at. There's some very interesting things there. Also in the room today, there is a small exhibition on the chaplaincy work that Downside monks did during the First World War, which is a travelling exhibition which has been to several places already, and also setting Downside in the broader historical context. We have the watercolours of Janet Trelaw on Romanesque art around the room as well. I'm sure that Gasquet would be delighted if he saw what this building, built as a dormitory during the time he was prior, now has landed up as a library and a place of scholarship. Thank you very much.